Hello, good morning for me. I am currently in Europe. Good evening for you in Tokyo. Today we're honored to have Dr. Carleton, Dr. Cockayne from Stanford University visit us at Tech Tokyo. As always, the session will be recorded. There are Japanese subtitles, and I will let them introduce themselves. Thank you very much for joining us, and we're looking forward to sharing your knowledge. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, we are delighted to be here. The topic of today's session is building your innovation network. And the focus is really about understanding how can you think more strategically and practically about the connections in your ecosystem, and what are some ways that you might grow and expand the connections that you have already, and look at even building new connections in different ways. Now, I'm leading the session with my longtime partner and book co-author, Bill Cockayne. The two of us have spent time in Silicon Valley, which is a massive innovation ecosystem, the #1 innovation hotspot in the world, and have also worked in different innovative regions globally. That includes Tokyo, but also places in the African continent, such as Cape Town, in Europe, such as Munich and Helsinki and Mexico City, and so forth. And so part of this is to recognize these networks regionally exist everywhere, but they also cross boundaries. So what I thought I would share at the start of the session is a little bit around how we might think about networks. And then we're going to share one of the tools that we use as part of our work. So this is a concept that you might have heard before called team of teams. And for those that are hearing this for the first time, you can find a very nice book summary that is a few years old, easily a decade old, with the same name, Team of Teams, by a retired U.S. Army general, along with 2 Navy SEALs and a writer that talks about this concept. And the story describes how the team, really learned about some different organizational models, thinking about how people collaborate. And this was in the context of military operations. In particular, you can see on the screen here, for those joining also online, the command and control model, very common in the US military and in other defense groups around the world. The reason this structure exists is very much about life and death decisions, right? How do you move information efficiently? How do you make sure that the people on the front lines know what to do? And it's really less about co-creation or even collaboration, and much more about quick cooperation. Now, McChrystal found that this didn't work exactly with military operations. And in particular, he was responsible for the mission of Osama bin Laden for the US military. And he found that the enemy that he was working against, the terrorists, didn't respect this command and control model. And in particular, had a very different way of thinking about teams, much more bottom up, much more kind of disintermediated or spread around. In fact, many of the units didn't necessarily know about each other. And so McChrystal realized he needed to experiment with how he thought about networks. And so he tells the story where he moved to the second model you see here, a command of teams. And so he mixed the internal units. So you can imagine within the Army space, the soldier, the analyst at the Pentagon, or the military operator, and so forth, were all mixed here. And then there was a parallel mix happening with another military force, such as the Air Force and then the Marines and so on. Well, this was effective in increase the communication flow and even the touch points within these groups, but they didn't talk across. And so McChrystal realized he needed to try another way of working, in particular, how to think about the ecosystem structure. So he moved to this team of teams. Now, this is not a new concept, but it allowed him to really overlap different types of networks. And in doing so, he relied on much more transparency, much more trust in making sure people knew and felt that they could be aware of what's going on, that they were invited. Now, they may not be the key decision makers, but they were part of this overall mixing. And so this was really important, and McChrystal credits the success of his military operation unit with this type of model. And the story doesn't end there. The book is really the realization that this type of working exists in other places, in healthcare, in education, in business. And it's a reminder that this is a way that different groups work in many different types of spheres. And in fact, I'll share an example here from Stanford. Bill and I have a long history. Not only did we do our doctorate work there, Bill had been teaching easily for 2 decades with a leading class in strategic foresight. I go back every summer lately and have a moonshots boot camp that I run. And you can see here a ecosystem map of a long-running Stanford class, which has been taught continuously, or I should say repeatedly, for over the last 50 years. And the class is all about helping students learn to work in teams. And in doing so, they learn to work in teams of teams. And this is a snapshot from a decade ago. And you can see here in red, this is the Stanford example, where there were 10 teams averaging between 3 to 4 students at a time working on corporate sponsored projects. And you'll see some logos here that you might recognize, right? SAP, IKEA, and so forth. And then these Stanford teams ended up being partnered with student teams at other academic institutions around the world. And so you can see we have some from Germany, from Australia, from Switzerland, Portugal, and even Japan and other parts of Asia had been involved. I share this because you can see the students were already learning to work in teams, so it wasn't new to them. They were working with teams that were on the company side, which you don't see is reflected here. There were also supporting teams in terms of the teaching with coaches and the professors and faculty that were involved. And one of the key lessons here is that as we think about the networks, they also change over time, right? It's not just the same set of partners. Here in this class, it was a good reminder that the map also changed to the point where by the time it got to 2014 into 2015, the team that was responsible for putting the visuals together relied on software to figure out the placement on paper. So you can see here, it's important to also start to realize here are young people already learning how to work in teams. So this is something that's not new for them. It's just a reminder of the way ideas get moved around and how we think about who we surround ourselves with. And also, there were partners that would come back a few years later and kind of work together, right? And where you sit in the network also shapes your view. So this is going to be an important point when we introduce our tool in a minute. You can see some quotes here from different key people involved with the Stanford network. And it was part of a class called ME 310. And then there was a surrounding network of the international teams that started to work with each other, not just with Stanford. And that became known as the Sugar Network. So you can see here is Larry Leifer, who has been emeritus for the past few years, where he talked about, the value or the motivation of working with Stanford versus here is Philip Skogstad, who actually had started out as a student, then helped to shape the network at a German or Swiss German institution, and then ended up sponsoring projects as a corporate sponsor. So he had different hats and realized multiple viewpoints versus a German partner here who looked at what did it mean to support the international movement and how do you create the global infrastructure. And so realize where you sit is important as well, and how you think about the connections that you make. Well, actually, let me pause here. Do we have any questions or comments around the team of teams and the short case of Stanford? No worries. And also feel free to put any comments in the chat if you'd like. So with that, let me share a tool that we use. And we didn't mention this at the beginning, but we'd like to have you find some paper and a pen or a notebook if you have it nearby. You can also do this digitally as well. But one of the tools that we found very helpful is Crowd Clovers, and you can see it highlighted here. Now, this set of tools is part of our Foresight framework, which is from the Playbook for Strategic Foresight and Innovation. And we have since developed an additional set of complementary tools that focus on the radical innovation, building moonshots, and it continues that forward-facing view. Now, with Crowd Clovers, the focus here is on mapping your network. And we're going to invite you to think about your own personal network first. And you can do this again with your project team, with your business unit, with an organization. And it's all about understanding who you work with and how you can build those connections. Yes, I mentioned that it was part of the playbook. We're going to end with that. So Bill, would you like to come up here and talk? Okay. He's sharing some comments on the side. We'll have him tell stories in a little bit. So one thing here, and I'm going to draw with my hands, and then later you can imagine what it's like in front of a whiteboard, because that's really how we love to teach. But there are 4 aspects to bringing or visualizing what your network looks like. So you can say, all right, here you are at the center, right, of your universe. And for many cultures, the symbol of the 4-leaf clover is seen as good luck. And what we're going to do is map out how do you think about your personal network in terms of these 4 categories. So I'm going to start on the left for convenience, and you can start anywhere. So here you can see catalysts. Think about people in your life who provoke you, who sparks you with new ideas, who gets you to imagine new possibilities. Perhaps they get you to think out of the box, right? In my life, I would add my children here, particularly my son when he was a toddler, really had me rethink the interaction models we use with the devices. Particularly, he's grown up as a tablet kid, right? And we walk into a consumer electronics store and he goes up to a screen playing a show he doesn't want, and he tries to swipe it off. And later, of course, he realizes that different devices have different interaction models. But at the time, I simply explained bad TV, broken. And that got me thinking, well, maybe it is actually broken, because why would it need to work that way, or that has to be my explanation. So it was very interesting. And so he was the catalyst for me. Now, connectors is the second category. You want to put down and think about people you know who connect you to resources, assets, equipment, money. It essentially allows you to, these are people who allow you to grow your effort in some way. So I can think about, my work here with Tech Tokyo, and I've gotten to know the director, Jorge. He, could be put down here as a connector in my life, connecting me to the broader consortium here in Japan and all the members that are involved. On the right, we have enablers. And in this category, you want to think of people who help you, right? They enable you to deliver, to go from idea to action. If catalysts are 1% inspiration, enablers are the other 99% perspiration. And so I could say in my life, I would put down a number of people. For example, I have 2 students helping me as part of a distinguished professorship I hold with a top school in Latin America. So I would say, okay, Vanya and Maximo, they are my enablers. They help me deliver and are critical as part of my network. Last but not least, we have promoters. And these are people who help promote you or your idea. And they often sit in other networks, or maybe they cross networks. Now, some of these categories overlap, but for promoters, they can introduce you and kind of warm up the party. They don't necessarily have access to resources and funding, but they might know the people who do. So they can then connect you, or I should say, put you in touch with the connectors who then help you have access to resources. But they themselves do not own that asset. And there may be people in your life that hold several of these roles. So if you think about this, start to consider, okay, who are people I know? Where would they sit? I could even say, all right, I mentioned the other speaker here, Bill, he holds several of these roles in the work that I do. And so what we'd like to do is invite you to take a minute or so and write down, okay, who serves as a catalyst, a connector, enabler, or promoter in your life. And what's also important is then to highlight who do you have a formal relationship with, right? And by formal, I mean it is a relationship where there are clear roles and responsibilities. There might be a contract. Informal describes often family or friends. So I mentioned my son, he would be an informal relationship, versus I mentioned the work that I do with these 2 students. With the university, we have special contracts and agreements in place as part of the university structure. So they are very formal. Now, you might have relationships that start formal that could become informal, right? And so this is part of recognizing how do they sit. So you could circle these people. In the earlier example, you see the boxes drawn around them. This is important. And there's a whole set of research around the importance of informality and formality in the connections we build, particularly in Silicon Valley, many stories of informal. So why don't you write down some names in your life and who you can think about, and then we'll talk a little bit about what this looks like.
I have a question in the meantime, if I may.
Yes.
Um, would you like to comment on the concept of formal versus informal in the context of Japan, which might be slightly different from other Western countries?
Oh, that's a good question around kind of the level of formality, especially in the Japanese context. And I can start, and then maybe, Bill, let me invite you up to the front and share some stories around this as well. Uh, I think this, well, the reason informality is important for innovation is it helps to allow people to feel more relaxed. They become more open to sharing. You see more knowledge spillover occurring because boundaries become softer, right? For Japan, this is trickier in many ways. There are often higher barriers or organizational structures in place. And what I found is a lot more of the idea mixing tends to happen still very naturally, with people that go out for drinks, either for, matcha drinks or for beers. And that might occur after work or during a work break. And so that to me starts to allow that kind of softening of the borders. And I hear stories from different Japanese colleagues where a formal project or a very clear role as program officer or something then starts to take shape in terms of other innovation activities when they start to get to know somebody, and they might do more of kind of informal, not just networking, but story sharing about each other's personal lives or hobbies, discovering maybe different books that they like, or stories where they might enjoy running or discover they have a shared appreciation for dogs or cats. And suddenly you start to realize more of the other person as a person. And it's just the whole psychology is that then opens up more innovative behavior in the sense that now you can start to feel comfortable bringing other ideas into the mix. And it's not just strict transactions of work and conversations. And I think that's much more human, regardless of being in Japanese culture or in European culture or other places where there are also a lot of kind of more regulated or strict kind of boundaries and ways of working. And for those online, you're definitely welcome to share any thoughts in the chat. And this to me is also important for conversations that happen outside of a session. So if I think about Tech Tokyo and other events, there's one formal part where, for example, like me and Bill sharing these types of ideas, but then you stay longer and you linger and you talk with one another. And that's where you start to see more of that informal sharing, not just passing of business cards, but other ideas or questions that spark different possibility or new topics to explore. So some thoughts off the top of my head there.
Thank you.
Well, let me move to this slide here, which gets or helps to summarize different ways that you might see what's possible, right? Common practices, or not practices, I should say, more common insights that you might realize about your own network. Because you could say, do I find that some of it feels more lopsided, or I only know some people in certain areas? Or maybe my network feels too formal or informal, right? As you do this assessment. Or you might say, how do others see me? Where do I sit? So if I take this first insight here. My network feels too small. Well, there's no magic number in the number, in the people that you should know for your innovation network. But if you would like to grow your network, one of the best ways to do it is that you could kind of rekindle recent touches. So you have to think back over the last few days, even weeks, and say, all right, who have I crossed paths with that I saw that maybe was at a meeting or was on a group call? And you could then reach out and share some updates and then just say, hey, I was thinking about you, or do you need something, or I'm working on this project. This is a way to take what might be lukewarm and add a little bit of fire to kind of light it up. Now, you might say, well, I don't know enough people. For example, I find a number of technical people feel that they might have a lot of connectors, but maybe not enough promoters in their life. So then you could turn to the people you trust and say, okay, you know me. Who might you suggest that I talk to? Who could complement or extend or help me in these other areas? So that's one of the ways that you might bring it to life. This third one, I rely on the same people for everything. This is very common, particularly in work situations or small teams. And then suddenly you might have one team member step away for a maternity leave or sabbatical. And suddenly you realize that person leaves quite a gap. And one of the best ways, and this actually came up the other day as I was watching a cat special, that even for cat researchers, and this was validated by a cat expert in Japan, that even for cats, it's less about the food versus the social motivation. And same with humans. Studies show that it's not the financial reward, but it's really the social recognition. It's the appreciation that actually helps to motivate and validate the work that we do together. So if you rely on somebody on the team, or if you're a boss, one of the best ways is to simply say, thank you. I see the good work that you're doing. I'm really glad you're part of the team. And I've talked with a number of companies that have actually added a little touch of formality to this kind of very informal practice to remind those that are in senior positions or managing teams to do these types of I'm trying to think of one of the names of the companies. They don't call it shout outs, but they're like pats on the back just to say, you're doing a great job. I really am glad. So consider this. And some people I know even have reminders on their calendar, every other week just to say, let me make sure I can recognize somebody. It's more of a nudge. It's not a requirement, but it's a good thing to do. I'm going to jump down the last point here. And we talked about teams of teams. If you manage a team, you can help build their connections too. And you can think about ways that you might, support kind of impromptu or informal group gatherings. It doesn't always have to be over food. But if you are on site, that is a very easy and warm way to engage others. But you can also do digital versions to recognize, bring in outsiders, other voices. You might feature a guest speaker, or maybe you have somebody drop by and just say, hey, join our meeting for a little bit. It does take some intention, but it also pays back quite a bit. It's really shaping that network growth. And so it's another way to really expand the kind of connections that you're developing. And I mentioned a few minutes ago, if you think about where you stand in your network, you might say, well, Maybe you're serving much more as an enabler. You're helping somebody get work done. You're a critical piece in the overall value chain, often a common role for those that are starting a position. And as you start to take on more responsibility, you can then move up into be a connector and help others find interns or project funding, and then other types of work. And then you could become much more of the promoter and the catalyst, because now you're serving as a mentor or a role model and even champion the next set of leaders that are coming up. So realize there's a whole set of ways that you can grow your network, but also those around you. And your role too changes over time. Networks themselves are dynamic. Now, this is a reminder that, we started with the personal analysis, but you can do this again for your group. And we won't do it here, but you could think about, all right, how do I take this same exercise and maybe you put in group names here throughout and use this as a way to say, what do we have formal relationships with? Are there certain groups that are dominant? Who's underrepresented? Who's missing? Whose voices should we be considering? And it's another way to think about your network using this tool. Now, I mentioned this earlier. We went through it quite quickly. Here, I'm not sure how many of you had a chance to draw your own network, but we have the tool right here, Crowd Clovers, in the Playbook for Strategic Foresight and Innovation. This is a free resource. I should say the PDF is free to download. The book itself costs some money, I should say, to purchase on Amazon. But consider this a resource, and you can find step-by-step instructions, a worksheet, some group reflection tips for the Crowd Clovers tool in the Playbook. Now, Bill, would you like to share any stories?
Nothing, unless you have a handoff.
Well, here, I can share this last bit and then I can hand off to you to maybe add some other points around as well. A more recent book we launched is Building Moonshots, and this came out in early 2023. The focus of the book is very much on big ideas. And I'm not going to go through the whole book, but I'm going to highlight one piece that ties into building your connections. Now, this book describes 9 different categories for thinking about these big ideas, right? Moonshots are these almost impossible visions that have potential big impact. Not just going to the moon, which is really the first literal moonshot, but even today, how we think about some of the big ideas. And in Japan, there is an R&D moonshot program that started with 9 moonshots. Now I think it's up to 14 that are really big ideas to transform Japanese society. Now, companies can think about moonshots, government agencies seek to fund them. There's family offices and foundations that are also chasing this type of radical ideas. And so you can see here a range of content and kind of best practices describing not just how to start with the mindset, but thinking about, all right, how do you actually lay the steps for the roadmap? How do you consider the big bets in terms of financing? And then playing the long game. I'd like to jump in the middle of the book to Moonshot Way 31. And this way talks about how do you think about your challenge board. And this is important as you start to build your network, not just finding people who can, be your echo chamber. You're not looking to always have to be validated. When you're doing innovative work, you also want to be challenged. You want others in your life to have the ability and what's the word? Comfort for you both to say, maybe we need to do something differently or bigger, or consider, another path forward. So here's two examples that talk about this idea of the challenge board. So on the left, you can see Adam Grant. He's a popular psychology writer. And he points out that we learn more from people who challenge our thought process than those who affirm our conclusions. And the reason is they challenge because they care. You're not looking for people that help you feel bad. Those people do exist. But if you can find the people in your life who are the ones that tell you when you have spinach between your teeth, right? They're doing this because they're trying to build you up. And they have a very kind of positive contribution to make. And this definitely played out in the life for Andrew Ng. He's a Stanford professor. He has been very involved pioneering work in AI. And he found that as he became more experienced, more and more people would agree with whatever he said, which became worrying. And he had to actively seek out people who would challenge him and tell him the truth. So think about this. As a final self-reflection, and you think about your own network mapping, who sits on your challenge board? Who are these people that challenge because they care? That's important to consider. And these are people that also allow you to grow personally. And you may have these people also on your team, in your group. They can play a bit of the what's called devil's advocate role, but they also can raise the tough questions that allow your team and your group to do bigger, better things. The last point that I'd like to make here ties back to a early, I'll say, motto or truth that Bill and I developed, which is what you foresee is what you get. When it comes to your network, it's also about how you consider imagining and visualizing what's possible. So what you foresee, what you think is possible, what you can anticipate or see as the outline shapes the outcome, right? So if you can see positive, the glass is half full, or a new type of glass container, well, that's going to open up more options for what you consider, right? That shapes your outcomes and what you get. And this is important because this is about the mindset, not just for doing moonshot work, but also thinking about the ecosystem you're developing and how it fits in and where it goes together. So let me pause here, and I'm going to invite Bill just to at least show his face and share a story, since I've had a chance to talk about all of these points.
What stories were you looking at?
Maybe Silicon Valley's an ecosystem.
Well, yeah, sure. We could all do that all day long.
You're turning off the...
Well, yeah, the slides. So we can turn the camera off. And sharing is stopped. Yeah, so we can show up. So no, I was going to say the question Jorge asked earlier about the... Well, you can stay up here.
I will.
The question Jorge asked earlier about the networks, right? So did you put our emails up on the slides?
Next one that you closed.
Oh, well, bring the slides back up then, because that's the huge piece of it, right? So the informal network should have been right at the beginning, which is everyone can just reach out to us, right? I mean, I have never had a formal role in Japan that I know of. So actually the slides aren't even running anymore. So I'll start them again. So I've never had a formal role in Japan ever, but I've been coming here for 30 years, I think. What formal roles have we had?
Oh, goodness.
So we worked for Kenji for the longest time, which was where?
Osaka Institute of
So
Technology.
Osaka Institute of Technology. We were guest professors there for, gosh, close to 5 or 6 years, because Kenji is an old friend from Stanford. So we had a formal role in Japan, which was part-time. I think we went out and hung out with high school kids, which was great. And it's not sharing again. So the reason that, so that was formal because we actually met Kenji at Stanford. He had actually worked at Panasonic for years in America, having come from Japan. And then he invited us to come over, and it's coming up. So Kenji had invited us to come over and help. And I think we came over, a couple times a year to do workshopping. But I think the bigger piece was just the informal connection. So every time we would meet somebody, I think we picked up cards, and that was the easiest way to bring voices back. And that's a big part of why I think we're here was, you met Jorge online. I don't think you've ever even met him face to face, have you? No, I don't think you guys have ever met, but it was an easy introduction online. I don't remember why you guys met online. I just remember the story. Mm-hmm. And then he curiously isn't here today. Well, we're here, and he's in Europe, where we're normally in Europe and the US. So that's just very funny. But I think it's really interesting that's the informality that we're very used to coming from places like Silicon Valley in the US, is that once you have somebody's email or WhatsApp or Signal or Line, it's easier just to reach out to everybody. You have formal roles as professor at 7 schools, 8, something like that. Then you have your formal contracts, but then who else do you keep in touch with? Who else do you help? Students, alumni? How many recommendation letters have you written in recent years?
Oh, yes.
Too many to count?
Yes.
So you got to step out of the way a little bit. I think we'll get nice photos there.
Oh, yes.
So I think Jorge, to the part that, the conversation is interesting for me, because I've really never been formally connected to Japan, but I've been coming here since I was in my 20s, because a friend brought me over, and she's still a good friend. She had come to America as a student. I met her while I was a student, and she went on to complete a medical degree in the US and a doctorate in the US, and she's practicing in the US still. But she, we trade notes. We just traded WhatsApps the other night, and she's not here in Japan right now, but she immediately told me where to go to get the best dinner that a place I hadn't gone to. And that, it's an informal relationship going back 30 years. But I think a lot of the stuff you and I do, particularly with universities, where, you teach a student once, but you're connected to them forever. And I think that's always been true of the work we did at Stanford, which was, we've got so many colleagues. So I don't know if that answers your question, Jorge, but that's, I think, how we've always worked is I just, everybody I know in Japan's a friend more than anything.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was speaking from the point of view of the formal side of things, and I agree with you that my relationships in Japan also feel quite personal and quite close and informal. But when you engage in a formal capacity, in my experience, the line is drawn in a much stronger and clearer way than it is perhaps in Europe, and definitely in the United States. In the United States, I've worked for companies, for universities, but there was this sense of blurred line, like, yeah, my boss, but my friend, but my colleague, but my customer. In Europe, the line is a little bit more formal in appearance, but at the end of the day, it's all relationships. And in Japan, I'm finding that both exist, both are important, but they feel slightly more, if not separate, more clearly defined. There's a seriousness to the formal that is very present. That was my point of view.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I grew up on the US East Coast, which even today I would say matches the conversation you're having more. If you're in a Washington, D.C. area, traditionally, your formal networks are very powerful and your formal networks matter. And if you step outside of them, you have to know you're stepping outside of them, and you may get critiqued. Similar stories are told about Boston by people who go to the programs there. And there's this concept of what's called the Boston Brahmin, which of course is the families that have always lived in Boston and the families that always went to the right schools and the right churches. And to see those people outside of the formality was always strange. I dropped out of college and went to the West Coast because when I got to California, and I was working with Apple Computer in the late 80s, when I got to California, you could run into your boss at the coffee shop, and the next thing you know, you were having a conversation that was about work or wasn't about work. And the informal networks tended to dominate, particularly when you'd run into somebody and they would say, oh, hey, I've got a friend doing a startup. Can you come over and talk to them for a few minutes? You might know something. Or you would run into someone on weekends, and literally coffee shops were like the dominant part of our lives in the 90s. And that was where people met after work. And the moment you met after work, it wasn't a work conversation. The roles inverted. If you were the young person with a lot of energy, the older bosses wanted to listen to you because you brought new knowledge that maybe you didn't know you had. So that the inversion really, I think, drives the innovation model in Silicon Valley. I mean, the number of times that, Tamara and I get a call out of the blue from students who we've taught. We've been teaching at Stanford for 20 plus years. We'll get a call and two kids will say, hey, you haven't heard from us in 4 or 5 years. We were really busy. We were at Google, we were at Apple. And then they'll say, I've got this startup I'm working on right now. Can we talk to you? And as they're talking and we're putting names together going, oh, you need to call this person. And they just exited. And this person, we just had dinner with them. That informal network is, I think, what's really interesting about the Valley is it drives this kind of new ideas, new energy, new networks, and the new networks become startups, right? And that's really what the Valley's model's built on is always new startups and new teams. And again, there's still very large traditional companies like Apple, like Cisco, like Google, which I would compare a lot more to my memory of the old days of, I worked with Sony 20 years ago, and you've worked with Panasonic, very strong, powerful companies where people start when they're young and they retire from the same company years. I mean, we have that in the Valley. It's just that recycling, I think, really comes from the informal part, much more than this formal. I was just reading an article on the way over about all of the AI startups, which ones are buying each other. And part of it's just to get the founder, to get one person. And they're going to move these people around in different networks, and it's all going to recycle. And then when the economy crashes, they're all going to reset again, which is not going to be formality, right? No one's going to have a job anymore. So they're all going to be trying to hire each other and just see what they can help with each other with.
Well, yes, I was going to say, to me, this particular topic is intended to help open up some thinking around how we consider our innovation networks, ways that we build, and some practical tools, not just thinking about the challengers who care, but also how we can map out a Crowd Clover type analysis. How do we think about those that might play different roles in our life and being just more aware of who they are and how we value these people, and that to take that also moment to recognize the people that truly allow us to be innovative and can expand and grow in new ways. So I want to thank Tech Tokyo for allowing us to share some of these ideas, and I hope you stay connected. Either find us on LinkedIn or reach out by email or your platform of choice. And want to thank everyone as well for joining in. So thank you.
Email us, please.
Yes, definitely email and reach out, as you might have heard Bill say. I think, Jorge, you're on mute.
Thank you. I was saying thank you very much for sharing your experience, your knowledge. We will definitely be in touch. I'm very interested in the intersection of those clover leaves, right? Like, how do you get the connector, help the catalyst, and bring together, I mean, how to amalgamate all of that into one. And that's in a nutshell what we're trying to do at Tech Tokyo. We're trying to play several roles at once. Sometimes it's challenging balancing all those acts, but definitely we love for you to be part of that. So we'll be in touch. But for the time being, thank you for visiting, and hope you enjoy the rest of your trip in Tokyo. Thank you very much.
Excellent. And happy holidays.
Happy holidays.